critical role in history, an invention which has been praised and denounced, served hero and villain alike, and carries with it moral responsibility. To understand the gun is to better understand history. A hidden derringer, a cheap rifle, a clumsy revolver. These are not fancy weapons, expensive to buy or difficult to obtain, but they change the course of history. They are not pretty to look at and not valued for their art, but they are unique pieces of history because they are connected to deeds of infamy. The assassinations of Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and the Kennedys. These are the weapons that destroyed dreams. The guns that started wars. The tools of notorious outlaws.
On the right.
They are highly sought and feverishly desired.
1706 for $25,000. Lot number 23.
They command a lot of attention and have great value, all because they connect those who possess them to real moments in history. These are guns of infamy. Some are on public display, housed in well-known museums. Others remain in property rooms of government agencies, still kept as criminal evidence. And some are sought by collectors who want them as treasures, both monetary and historic. Greg Martin is the director of the Arms and Armor Department for Butterfield & Butterfield in San Francisco. There at gun auctions, the value of infamy is measured in dollars.
50,000 bid there. 50,000, 55 is bid. 55 is over here. 60,000 is your bid. It's 60,000 now the bid.
Historic guns have always brought a lot of money. The gun itself can be of relatively modest value, but the history behind it will bring it up to a great extent.
Sold for $75,000. 1602 is for $75,000. Lot number 20.
It is not unusual for these historic weapons to command prices in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It depends on the weapon and the deed, and the documentation connecting the weapon to the deed. The rifle that killed John F. Kennedy, for example, has clear provenance, the proof of authenticity. But the gun used to kill the outlaw Jesse James, the proof is not so clear. And some weapons of infamy are probably lost to history, but that doesn't make them any less infamous. Among the most famous guns known to the world are the arms that started wars. Such is the case of the weapon that fired the first shot of the American Revolution. According to legend, this was the shot heard round the world, a symbolic ball of lead fired by a citizen farmer turned Minuteman. It happened April 19, 1775, near the Massachusetts hamlets of Lexington and Concord. More than a half-century later, Ralph Waldo Emerson immortalized the moment. It was his poetic line, recorded July 4, 1837, which got people thinking, if there was a shot heard round the world, then who fired it? And from what gun? Rampant speculation surrounds two types of Revolutionary War arms, the musket and the pistol. Three particular weapons in Massachusetts may be connected to the moment. One is this musket, held here by the descendant of a Revolutionary War veteran. It is housed at the Massachusetts State House in Boston. The others are a pair of pistols on display at the Concord Museum. While it can't be determined which gun actually started the American Revolution, history knows exactly the type of gun that started the first modern war in the history of the world.
I think there is no doubt whatsoever that a Browning 1900 pistol in the hands of Gavrilo Princip started World War I. It's as simple as that.
The Browning 1900. It was designed by John Browning, an American, but he couldn't interest an American manufacturer. So he took it to Europe.
Fabrique Nationale of Liège in Belgium bought the idea off him and decided to manufacture it, and it became their Model 1900. And it was the first 32 caliber automatic pistol ever to go on the market. It was a very simple weapon. It didn't have any breech lock or anything like that. It was relatively easy to manufacture. It was very simple to use. It was accurate. It was reliable.
It was also very inexpensive, which made the Browning pistol common issue in various European armies, possibly including the Nationalist Army of Serbia. In June of 1914, Serbia was part of the ancient Austro-Hungarian Empire, ruled by the Habsburg dynasty from Vienna. But the Serbs wanted their independence. Toward that, an underground movement was started by a group of dissidents who called themselves the Black Hand Gang.
It was a secret society dedicated to Serbian nationalism. They were financed and, generally speaking, steered by the Serbian army.
Among those recruited by the Black Hand Gang was a naive 19-year-old student at the University of Belgrade named Gavrilo Princip. He became a willing pawn of the Serbian independence movement. On June 28, 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife came to Sarajevo. Ferdinand was the heir to the Habsburg throne, an important figure in the Austrian government, and, ironically, sympathetic to Serbian independence.
He was also Inspector General of the Army, and in that role he'd been down to the edge of Austria, as it were, to see some of the army in their annual summer manoeuvres, and took a day off with his wife to go and celebrate their wedding anniversary with a banquet in Sarajevo.
Somewhere in the crowd that greeted the royal procession was Gavrilo Princip. In his possession was a Browning Model 1900 pistol, presumably obtained through contacts in the Serbian army. When the parade came by, Princip and a fellow conspirator made their daring move.
His companion threw a bomb and missed, and then Princip dashed forward with the pistol, and he didn't miss. He assassinated the Archduke.
Also killed was the Archduke's wife. Immediately, Princip was arrested by Serbian authorities. Then the Austrian government demanded that Princip and his co-conspirators be turned over to them.
And the Serbians said, no, we are a sovereign nation. We will deal with it in our own way. And in this refusal of the Serbs to allow the Austrians free access, the Austrians saw the opportunity to throw their weight about, and they issued an ultimatum. But of course, as soon as they did that, Serbia appealed to her ally, Russia. Russia said, if you do anything, we will mobilize. Germany said, if you mobilize, we will mobilize. And the French said, if he mobilizes, we'll mobilize. And the English said, good God, if they mobilize, we've got to mobilize. And the whole thing was a chain reaction. And as soon as the Serbians failed to back down, everything went into effect. Everybody mobilized. The war was on.
Indeed, the war was on. It was a war that ended an age of innocence and brought new destructive technology to bear upon humanity, causing the catastrophic loss of 10 million lives. For its sinister role, the Browning Model 1900 pistol had more than earned a place in infamy. Today, the actual gun used by Gavrilo Princip might be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to avid collectors, but its location is unknown. It is perhaps the most infamous and most valuable gun in American history. The Derringer used by John Wilkes Booth to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln.
It would be hard to calculate what that gun would bring at auction. It would bring a tremendous amount of money. It is one of the most important historic firearms in American history.
The gun itself is an interesting piece of hardware with its own unique history.
The Derringer received its name from Henry Derringer, the first manufacturer of a small pistol. These were all handcrafted guns, and they had one characteristic mainly, is that they fired 1 or 2 shots, and they could be usually concealed or held in the palm of the hand, and were of large caliber for close-range use or self-protection.
Henry Derringer designed and manufactured his innovative pistol in the city of Philadelphia. Because of this, the model received its full name, the Philadelphia Derringer. This small pistol became very popular. Soon, other gun manufacturers began producing similar versions of the weapon. While they weren't all made by Henry Derringer, they all came to be known as Derringers.
Henry Derringer spelled his name with 1 R, but his guns proved to be so popular that competitors would try to deceive the public by spelling it with 2 R's, and as a consequence, any small-sized pistol became generically known as a Derringer, which is now spelled with 2 R's.
Philadelphia Derringers are unique because they were made by Henry Derringer, and thus their historic and intrinsic values are increased. In the 1860s, Derringers were sold in pairs for $15 to $25. Today, they sell for much more.
An average model like this, in this condition, would sell for around $1,500 to $2,000.
But this is no ordinary Derringer. It was April of 1865. Robert E. Lee had surrendered his Confederate Army to Ulysses S. Grant on Palm Sunday, April 9th. Jefferson Davis was in flight, acting more like a fugitive on the lam than the President of the Confederacy. The South was defeated. The end was at hand.
Lincoln, at this point, was thinking about reintegrating the South into the nation and thinking about doing it with great magnanimity. In his second inaugural on the 4th of March, 1865, he said, with malice toward none and with charity for all. And he really meant that.
On Good Friday, April 14th, Abraham Lincoln and his wife attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. For the president, it was a time of great relief, and he allowed himself a moment to relax. But for John Wilkes Booth, it was a moment of anger, frustration, and vengeance.
John Wilkes Booth was a Shakespearean actor of a famous acting family, and he was a bit touched, many said. He was a bit crazed. He hated Lincoln, considered Lincoln a tyrant.
Booth devised a plan to assassinate the president during the Friday evening performance at Ford's Theater. About 10 o'clock, as the president and his company enjoyed the play, the assassins struck.
This is a gun very much like the one that killed President Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth. And it was made by Henry Derringer in Derringer's workshop in Philadelphia.
It fired a .44 caliber bullet ball. The way that this type of gun was loaded was gunpowder would be poured inside, and then the ball dropped in, tapped in. The hammer was cocked. A percussion cap is placed over the nipple. The gun trigger would be pulled. The hammer would strike the percussion cap. Little fire would shoot down the hollow nipple, ignite the gunpowder, and the ball would be discharged.
It was very good up close, especially 2 or 3 inches away.
In that one hellish moment, the course of American history was changed. Lincoln was the first U.S. president to be assassinated. The deed shocked the nation, but the lasting effect was far more devastating. It destroyed Lincoln's benevolent plan for reconstructing the Union. After Lincoln died, the politicians of the North imposed a vicious plan of radical reconstruction that had revenge at its heart.
Recovery of the South was really postponed, probably several decades, because of radical reconstruction. The South was taxed, it was punished, its leadership was decapitated. For at least 10 years, federal troops occupied the South. By John Wilkes Booth killing Lincoln, he killed the greatest friend the South would have had at the conclusion of the war.
This is the actual gun used by Booth. Today, it is housed at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Without question, it is a national treasure of enormous value.
It's probably the most recognizable gun of infamy, in that Lincoln was probably the most famous person assassinated. He has the greatest appeal in all element of collecting, of history. He's still extremely popular.
When you attach the infamy to this particular piece, it's incalculable almost. It'd have to come to auction or sale to really determine the price, but it would be into the several $1 million.
Lincoln was not the first nor the last politician to be killed by the gun. Throughout the 19th century, Americans witnessed other infamous deeds that changed the course of history. Among the most notorious guns in American history are these dueling pistols. They are connected to Aaron Burr. He was a leading figure of the Revolutionary era and later Vice President of the United States. Then came his famous duel with Alexander Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton always seemed to be around to spoil Aaron Burr's plans. Aaron Burr in the election of 1800 tied with Jefferson in the Electoral College. Now, the Jeffersonian Republicans who cast those votes clearly intended Tom Jefferson to be president and Aaron Burr to be vice president. So this meant that Aaron Burr should simply step down.
But Burr did not go quietly. Instead, he lobbied Congress to elect him president. Going against his own party lines, Hamilton, a Federalist, supported Jefferson. It was one of the most contentious elections in U.S. history, and Burr never forgot. In 1804, Burr was nominated for governor of New York by a group of politicians who wanted the state to secede from the new Union. Burr supported this plan.
Well, again, Alexander Hamilton was around to spoil Aaron Burr's plans. Alexander Hamilton exposed the entire plot, and this caused Aaron Burr to challenge Hamilton to the duel.
It's a very significant moment in American history, probably one of the most significant moments, and again, the gun was there to make history.
Actually, two guns, a pair of English-made Wagden dueling pistols.
They were long flintlock pistols, dueling style. When I mean dueling style, they were made especially for dueling purposes, which were long-barreled flintlock pistols, muzzle loaders, fired from a smooth-bore barrel with a patch ball.
These dueling pistols had hair triggers, And evidently Hamilton's went off prematurely, and the round sailed clear over Aaron Burr's head. Aaron Burr, on the other hand, took careful aim and drilled Alexander Hamilton in the chest. Hamilton lingered for several days before he expired.
Hamilton's death silenced a strong dissenting voice in the young government. Burr was stripped of all power and eventually went into exile and plotted military action against the government. As for the dueling pistols, they became the valued property of the Chase Manhattan Bank. Today, their estimated worth more than $250,000. 6 decades after the Hamilton-Burr duel, political assassination became a hard reality with the death of Lincoln. Then, just 16 years later, it happened again. James A. Garfield was sworn in as the 20th President of the United States in March 1881. 4 months later, he was shot by an assassin armed with a cheap but lethal weapon, an 1881 British Bulldog revolver. The assassin was named Charles Guiteau. He was a disgruntled office seeker who had supported Garfield for president in 1880. After the election, Guiteau asked Garfield to appoint him to a government position. It was not an uncommon request in an era when political patronage was rampant, but Guiteau was rebuffed.
He originally wanted to be appointed ambassador to Austria. He scaled it down to consul in Paris, then to consul in Marseille. He actually got to meet Garfield on one occasion. All his various letters were ignored, and subsequently he felt that God directed him to kill Garfield for this slight.
With assassination in mind, Charles Guiteau needed to buy a gun.
He went into a gun store, O'Meara's gun store in Washington, D.C., a couple of days before he assassinated Garfield, and looked at the various guns. He was drawn to a British Bulldog, again, because of the small size and large caliber, and he wanted one with an ivory grip because he thought it would look nice one day in a museum. He went back a day or two later and ended up buying one with wooden grips because he couldn't afford the ivory grips, which were $1 more. I believe he paid $10 for the gun.
It was awkward but powerful. It fired a large caliber bullet, and it was deadly at close range.
Well, it had a loading gate, styled after much of the guns of today. You merely pulled the loading gate down, you took your cartridge and placed one into the cylinder. You'd have to put the gun on half cock, pull the hammer back, and the cylinder turns, and you load. Once it's loaded, you close, ready to fire.
Guiteau made his move on July 2nd, 1881. He knew that the president was leaving that day from Union Station in Washington, D.C.
He ran up to James Garfield and his wife. They were at the train station in Washington, ready to leave for a vacation in New England, and Guiteau fired at point-blank range into Garfield's back.
Garfield lingered for months, finally dying in September 1881. Guiteau was tried, convicted, and hanged within a year. The legacy of Garfield's death was the establishment of the civil service, enacted in 1883 to eliminate political patronage. As for the British Bulldog revolver, it went to a museum, just as Guiteau had hoped.
The actual gun that Guiteau used ended up in the Smithsonian, where subsequently it was stolen. So ironically, the gun that he wanted to have preserved in a museum is not there anymore.
Exactly 20 years after the death of Garfield, a third U.S. president was assassinated. William McKinley was shot in September 1901 while visiting the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. The crime was perpetrated by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz. His motive was to bring down the U.S. government and open America to the revolution of the proletariat. His choice of weapon was a .32 caliber Iver Johnson revolver. It was an inexpensive gun, costing just a few dollars. It was also readily available and extremely popular. In a 10-year period between 1894 and 1904, Iver Johnson sold 2 million of them.
It derived its popularity from the fact that there was a unique mechanism at the time whereby the hammer itself did not have the firing pin attached to it. Rather, it was incorporated into the gun itself. You could have a loaded bullet in the chamber, hit the hammer, and the gun would not discharge or accidentally discharge. The bullet that was used was an extremely inefficient round, and the gun itself is notoriously inaccurate. I have fired this gun, and at 10 paces, the sighting is off by close to a foot.
Czolgosz probably knew the gun was inaccurate, so he got as close to McKinley as he could. His moment came when the president was greeting well-wishers at the exposition's Temple of Music.
As he went to shake the president's hand, he had the gun wrapped in a handkerchief, like a bandage around his hand, went right up and pushed it against McKinley, shot him, and the gun was so close that the muzzle flash caught McKinley's vest on fire.
McKinley was shot on September 6, 1901. He died a week later. Suddenly, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was president, a man considered by his own party to be a loose cannon, which is why they made him vice president.
They wanted to bury Theodore Roosevelt, and vice presidents throughout history have become obscure figures, unless, of course, the president is assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt now, at 42 years old, this 6 weeks shy of 43-year-old, comes into office.
Roosevelt became the most progressive president in a century. His administration built the Panama Canal, enacted antitrust laws, and established the National Park Service. Within 6 weeks of the assassination, Leon Czolgosz was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in the newly invented electric chair. His execution was reenacted on film by Thomas Edison. As for the Iver Johnson revolver, its estimated worth is $250,000. It's kept at the Erie County Historic Society in Buffalo, New York.
Lot number 2325, historic presentation percussion target rifle, and $2,000 for that one.
Perhaps the best way to gauge the value of historic weapons is at gun auctions, where the price of infamy is measured in dollars.
Lot number 18, historic Billy the Kid Colt single action. And
in May 1998, a gun allegedly used by one Henry McCarty, a.k.a. William Bonney, a.k.a. Billy the Kid, came up for auction in San Francisco.
Now to the far right. At 30,000, go 32.5 is over here.
This is the gun that Billy the Kid used in a famous jailbreak in which he killed 2 sheriff's deputies 2 weeks before he was killed by Pat Garrett.
The auction of this gun shows the popularity of weapons connected to outlaws of the Old West.
The outlaw gun is tied to the romance of the outlaw himself and the daring exploits that he did and the notoriety that he received at the time. This is a direct link and a biographical artifact of the deeds and the person who carried out the deed.
Characters in the West are highly romantic figures. Today, anybody that owns one of the guns used by these famous lawmen or outlaws has a very valuable artifact. It connects us to the real characters, the actual weapon they used.
The romanticizing of American outlaws has created great interest in their weapons. But the problem with most outlaw guns is provenance. What proof exists that the weapon in question was actually owned or used by the outlaw? In the case of this Billy the Kid gun, The story begins on April 28, 1881. On that day, the 21-year-old outlaw escaped from the Lincoln County Jail in New Mexico. Accounts of the jailbreak vary, but Billy the Kid definitely killed 2 lawmen and reportedly took 2 revolvers with him. He then, by one account, hid one of the revolvers in a tree and told a friend, who later retrieved the weapon. It was a Colt single-action .45 caliber Army revolver, serial number 22334. The friend traded the Colt to another man, who passed it down through his family. Eventually, it was donated to the New Mexico Symphony Orchestra, which consigned it for auction.
$40,000 is bid here.
The provenance is pretty good on it. You don't know if it's 100%, but there's good family provenance that this is the gun that he used. And it's about as good as it gets.
42.5 will be next. At $40,000 is bid there. Is there any advance at $40,000? No advance. $16.47 for $40,000. Lot number 19.
The auction price of $40,000 reflects the fact that the documentation on this gun was good, but not 100%. The truth is, Billy the Kid used many guns over the course of his short and violent life. In the only known photo of the outlaw, he is pictured with a Winchester Model 1873 rifle, and he is often associated with Colt single and double-action revolvers. But few of these guns have rock-solid evidence connecting them to the Kid. However, one rifle does. This is a Whitney Kennedy rifle, once owned by Billy the Kid. He gave it to a U.S. Marshal.
In the 1930s, the daughter of U.S. Deputy Marshal Eugene Van Patten traded a rusty, beat-up old rifle for a tank of gasoline. That rifle was this Whitney Kennedy rifle, which in fact had been given to her father by Billy the Kid. And it was acquired by a famous collector, Parker Lyon, who had a museum in Southern California, which was then, at his death, sold to a collector and shown in Reno, Nevada for many years, and came to the Autry Museum in recent years.
If it seems difficult to prove that Billy the Kid owned or used a particular gun, consider the case of another notorious outlaw, Jesse James.
Everybody has a Jesse James gun. I mean, if Jesse James had all the guns that have been attributed to him, it'd take a warehouse to fill them. Undoubtedly, he was one of the most infamous and famous of all bandits, and undoubtedly had a lot of guns and used a lot of different type of guns. But the guns that can be directly connected to him are relatively few.
This gun is fairly typical of the fact that most gun collections in the country will contain a Jesse James gun. This particular gun was claimed to have been found underneath Jesse James's house when the house was moved from its original location.
The problem of connecting Jesse James to any particular gun is his mother.
After Jesse James was killed, many people would come up to the James farm in Missouri and ask Jesse's mother for one of Jesse's guns. She was a astute, crafty woman, and she went to the local hardware store and would buy numerous rusted old relics for $1 or $2, and then cheerfully part with them for an exorbitant sum to the various collectors or relic hunters that came by.
Problems with authenticity, provenance, and outright fakes are common, especially because of the number of different outlaws that are popular in American history, and the number of guns they allegedly used. But there are enough outlaw guns with 100% provenance to stimulate the market. Greg Martin has seen many of them, including this revolver, which belonged to Cole Younger. It's worth $250,000. These guns were owned by Pat Garrett, the man who killed Billy the Kid. And these are guns of the bandit John Wesley Hardin. This is the bullet that killed him. The Autry Museum in Los Angeles has a Hardin gun display, which includes one of the outlaw-turned-lawyer's legendary business cards. The museum also owns a Frank James gun, and some of the guns that may have been used in the most famous Western shootout of all, the gunfight at the OK Corral. This gun once belonged to the famous frontier marshal and notorious gambler, Wild Bill Hickok. His lasting legacy is that he was shot while holding this poker hand. Aces and eights. Ever since the deed, it's been called the dead man's hand. All these guns are highly sought by museums and private collectors.
Lot number 730 is the
There is a great deal of competition. The institutions want to preserve them for the public at large so that everyone can enjoy or at least see or visualize or be somewhat a part of history. And the private collectors, same thing. So the competition can be intense, and that's why greater use is being made of auctions to let the market set the price.
at 100,000, bid back 105.
Whoever has the most faith and the most money gets the artifact.
Thank you, sir. 1755 for 110,000.
This may be the most infamous gun of the 20th century. It is a 6.5 caliber, model 9138, Mannlicher Carcano rifle, serial number C2766. It is an Italian rifle, once owned by Lee Harvey Oswald. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, at 12:30 in the afternoon, Oswald used it to assassinate the President of the United States. Lieutenant Carl Day of the Dallas Police Department was among the first to arrive at the scene of the crime, and he was the first member of law enforcement to physically handle the alleged murder weapon. At age 84, he retraced his steps that led him to the rifle.
It was shortly after 1 p.m. There was a police inspector standing there, and of course a lot of people around. He directed me to the 6th floor, where I understood there had been some cartridge cases found under a window where apparently the shooting had occurred. 2 of them were in the crack along with the wall over there. One of them was over here near the end of this box. The one that's away from the wall. And of course the shooting was out that window down that street.
The police made photographs of the cartridges, and Lieutenant Day dusted them for fingerprints. Then they continued their search.
Against that wall, there was a box extending out from the wall, and it obviously was where Oswald was sitting while he was waiting for the parade to come by. And we got a palm print off the top of that box.
15 to 20 minutes after finding the rifle shells, Lieutenant Day was called to the opposite corner of the 6th floor.
Back over yonder.
The rifle had been found.
It was down in a crack like that between the boxes. Here's the gun right here. Gun in there. Here's another view of it. I was pointing towards the gun here. It was down in that crack there. Just looking at it, I had no idea what it was. And down between the boxes, you couldn't tell too much about it. You could tell it was a bolt-action rifle. That's about all I could tell about it then. I reached down and got it. I could tell from looking at the rifle. It wasn't a show gun. It wasn't shined up. It's an old field piece, it looked like. Obvious that on that particular wood, there was not going to be any fingerprints. It was too rough. And I did check the little knob that's on the bolt, to satisfy myself there was no fingerprints on that little knob, which is about as big as the end of your thumb.
Lieutenant Day was then instructed to take the rifle back to his office and examine it more thoroughly for fingerprints. He didn't know what kind of rifle it was, but he had the serial number. Before going to his office, he gave that information to an agent from the FBI, Special Agent Nat Pinkston.
I obtained at that time a description of the rifle with the make and model and serial number, and left to try to trace the ownership of it. I went to a source of information of mine. He knew the rifles well enough to know that the rifle probably came from Tice Gettinger Company, a department store in Dallas at that time. They told me that their supply was Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago, and Klein's apparently had imported these guns from Italy. We got on the wire with our Chicago office and had them contact Klein's Sporting Goods stores, which by that time of the day, they were closed for the day. One of the agents went to the manager's home and picked him up and took him back to his office, and within a few minutes they had found a record of this particular rifle by serial number, and a record showing that it was shipped to Dallas to a person by the name of A. Heidel. I went to the police department where Oswald was being held, and at that time the police department let me observe the matters or materials that Oswald had in his possession when he was arrested. Among his identification papers was identification in the name of A.J. Heidel. The identification matched.
Within 12 short hours of the assassination, many facts were known about the rifle and its owner.
We were completely certain that Oswald was the person who owned the gun and had fired the gun. We felt that we had solved our case, basically.
After the assassination, events moved quickly. That evening, Lieutenant Day was seen on national television as he carried the rifle through a horde of reporters at the Dallas Police Department.
Apparently made it in 1940.
That night, the rifle was turned over to the FBI. Carl Day never touched it again. Today, it is the property of the U.S. government and is housed at the National Archives. There is no precedent to establish the monetary value of this rifle, but in 1963, it wasn't that much. Like the weapons that killed Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley, it was easy to buy and inexpensive.
Oswald saw an ad in the February 1963 issue of the American Rifleman magazine for Klein's Sporting Goods, and there is an ad for these surplus World War II Italian Mannlicher Carcano carbines.
The rifle was pretty cheap. It was $19.95 plus $1.50 for shipping, and that included a 4-power telescopic sight, which was mounted by Klein's personnel there in Chicago. The rifle is not on display currently. You can see photographs of it under certain conditions. The archivist at the National Archives may display it. You cannot touch it. In a sense, if the case is ever reopened, it's still evidence.
The full impact of John F. Kennedy's assassination may not be known until well into the next century. But his death is a stark reminder that the list of infamous guns has continued to grow. 2 days after Kennedy died, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot by Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner. His .38 caliber Colt Cobra was later auctioned for more than $200,000. In June 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles by Sirhan Sirhan. He fired a .22 caliber Iver Johnson Cadet. Today, that weapon is still held as evidence at the California State Archives in Sacramento. These are clearly some of the most infamous weapons ever created. It was certainly not the intent of their designers, but the infamy is, without question, the result of their owners.